Hello friends, in the context of the series which we are doing on the history of India from 1750s to 1857, today we will talk about the commercialization of agriculture. In the earlier discussion, we talked about the various kinds of crops with regard to the commercialization of agriculture, the way the British they in a way initiated the cultivation of these crops in India, and we talked about indigo in that context, that how indigo was being grown in India on a larger scale. We also talked about the international development which forced the British government to grow such kind of crops in India. And now we will talk about jute, that how the cultivation of jute took place in India, as it was non-existent before 1854 and 55. And Crimean War, which cut off the supply of flax from Russia to Britain, it led to the increased production to meet the foreign demand. And by the end of the 19th century, jute became largest export item from India. So we find that various kinds of crops which were being grown in India due to a lot of changes at the international level, and how Crimean War was also in a way responsible during that time, that how the foreign demand which was to be met, it could only be met when these kinds of crops they are being grown in India. And jute became the largest export item from India when we find that the cultivation takes place, and we find that it was a cash crop, and British they wanted that the land revenue, as the idea was that land revenue was to be paid in cash to them, and such kinds of cultivation of cash crops, be it tea, opium, indigo, jute and other crops, it will facilitate the British in terms of having some kind of a favorable balance of trade or to satisfy their industries. And we find that the prices of jutes they were very high, which resulted in the considerable prosperity in the growing areas of eastern Bengal. And the peasants they extended cultivation on their own initiative, but in the process they took advance from the moneylender and got indebted, leading to coercion. So in the case of jute also we find that because of the high prices there was prosperity in these areas, especially in the eastern Bengal. And when peasants they were trying to have the cultivation because of their own initiative, and when they took advances from the moneylender, they in a way became indebted to the moneylender, because of which you find that there was a coercion. So that was the kind of situation in the different in the different cash crops which were being grown by the Indian peasants because of the British pressure or because of the international situation. And even that international situation, we find that British they created this kind of a pressure on the Indian peasants to grow such kind of crops. Thereafter, now we will talk about sugarcane. And we find that the cultivation increased during the course of the 19th century due to the developments of the new markets, and also because of the more demand. And how the supply from the West Indies it also fell during this time because of the revolt of slaves who were providing the labor force to the British. So we find that demand it was increasing in Britain. Britain was requiring more and more sugar cane, and there was less supplies, and these less supplies were as a result of the kind of revolts against the British by the slaves, those who were engaged in the plantation areas. And as you can see on the screen as well, that the period which has been given from 1835-36 and 1845-46, you find that the export of sugar it increased tremendously. So we find that when the export it increased during this time, because British they asked they in a way demanded the peasants to grow more and more of sugar cane. And when these crops they were grown on the large scale, you find that they were exported also. And we find that in the context of sugarcane, more and more labor input is required in terms of the cultivation process. And when you require high labor input for the cultivation process, then we find that more high labor input is required, and it also gave some kind of a scope for coercion of the peasants. Whitcomb, she talks about the long period of the sugarcane cultivation, that how it explains the predicament of the peasants, that how they had to take advances from the landlords and the money lenders and had to sell produce to the agents below the market price. So some scholars like Whitcomb, those who have undertaken studies with regard to the sugarcane cultivation, they realize the kind of predicament or the problems of the peasants, those who were engaged in the sugarcane cropping, and how they were also seeking money from the landlords during this time. And this kind of a money which was taken from the landlords and the money lenders, and it had to be paid when the crop was to be sold, and that is how the prices of the crops, they were being decided before, and because of which you find that they were sold at a comparatively lesser price when you compare them with the prevailing market prices, which was in a way very inimical to the interest of the peasants or the agriculturalists, as they were not getting enough kind of money which was due to them. And on the other hand, the middlemen in the framework of the money lenders and the landlords, they were securing more share for themselves. So we find basically is that these kind of fruit grains which were being grown during this time, you can also see that different kinds of food grains, they were being grown, and the kind of readings which I suggested you in the earlier period, in the earlier lecture, they could also be referred here. And then mulberry was another important crop which was cultivated particularly in Bengal, and we find that silk industry was a flourishing area, and when British, they got control over Bengal, they destroyed the indigenous industries. Production and export of raw silk was encouraged, which increased during the Napoleon's continental blockade. So we find that in the context of the silk industry as well, that how British, when they secured control over Bengal during the Battle of Palasi and Buxar, and how they were able to secure the land revenue, of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, and thereafter you find that the indigenous industries, they got destroyed because of the policies which were followed by the British, and the production and the export of raw silk was encouraged, so that that raw silk could be used by the British for their own industries. And this kind of an activity, it was more evident during the continental blockade which was initiated by Napoleon. So we find that in the case of different food, in the different cash crops, be it tea or opium or indigo, mulberry, sugarcane, all these kinds of crops which were being grown by the Indian farmers, how British, they in a way used the Indian farmers so that so as to suit their own interests, and they created such kind of conditions where farmers, they did not have much options with regard to the cultivation of such crops. Then we also find that cotton was another important crop which was grown during this time, and the production of cotton, it shows the free peasant commercialization, that is no element of non-economic coercion was present, and it became important under the stimulus of foreign demand which was engineered by the cotton boom, especially during the American Civil War, as you can see on the screen, 1860s, and by opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. And the commercialization of cotton, it linked peasantry with the world market. So we find that how these kinds of crops which were being grown during this time, especially cotton and other kinds of crops which were being grown, and the international situation, it was also in a way conducive for the foreign demand, and the opening of the Suez Canal, for example, was one indicator that how trade could take place at a comparatively faster rate. And we also find that the commercialization of cotton, in a way, it linked the peasantry with the world market, and how Indian goods, they were being sold or they were being sent to the far off lands. And at many times we find that peasants, they extended the cultivation on their own accord. When we tend to find the kind of impact or the kind of effect which the commercialization of agriculture had on the Indian agriculture, we find that it was very beneficial for the colonial country, and Indian peasantry was affected by it. And the scholars, some of them, those who have done some kind of statistical analysis, they say that the overall impact was little, as it was carried out on a small proportion of the total cultivable land. And as late as 1891-92, only 27.9 million hectares of land out of 160 million hectares, only 16.5% land was under commercialized production. So we find that the kind of impact which the commercialization of agriculture had, it was only on the 16.5% of the land. So the scholars, those who in a way want to defend the colonial rule or the British rule, they talk in the context of the statistics. But on the other hand, we find that how the peasants, those who suffered, and they were quite large number of peasants, those who suffered because of this kind of a cultivation. So the qualitative kind of studies, they provide that kind of a picture where they talk about the situation of peasants which was there because of the commercialization of agriculture, and how the land revenue which was needed in cash during this time, and because of which peasants, they were in a way selling their produce during the harvest time when the prices were comparatively low, and then they were purchasing these products at a higher price, which were proving to be ruinous for the peasants in the long run. And Indian peasants was repeatedly made to bear the burden of widely fluctuating prices. So we find that the prices which were fluctuating at different levels, and how Indian peasant he had to bear the burden of such kind of fluctuations during this time, and how he was a sufferer because he was not getting handsome returns on the crops which were being grown by him, because British they were able to secure all sorts of benefits out of those crops which were grown by the peasants. And if we tend to understand this in the context of the role of the moneylenders, we find that moneylenders, they were more coercive during those times when they provided the advances to the peasants. They wanted to secure the cash crop at a time when the prices were low. So as soon as the crops they were being cut, they were being sold to the moneylenders, and moneylenders, they were purchasing those crops at a very nominal prices which were even decided even before the harvest. So such kind of coercion and extortion by the moneylenders or mahajans, it was in a way not helpful for the peasants. And we find during the colonial Raj that the triumvirate of Sarkar, Sahukar and Zamindar, all of them, how they were trying to oppress peasants in every way. Some of the historians like B.B. Chaudhary and Sabyasachi Bhattacharya, they have also tried to understand commercialization, and B.B. Chaudhary argues that in many cases it was not the traditional moneylenders but a new credit agency consisting of European planters or traders who gave advances. And Sabyasachi Bhattacharya talks about the British planters, how they used a system of coercion in order to keep peasants stuck to land. So historians, those who have worked on the aspects of commercialization of agriculture, they have argued that apart from the moneylenders, those who were coercive in nature, the credit agencies, new kinds of credit agencies where European planters were the main leaders in that sense, or other traders who were providing advances, and all of them, they were trying to coerce the peasants in every way, and this kind of a coercion in a way affected the peasants in the short run as well as in the long run. We also find when there was a lot of focus on the commercialization of agriculture during these times, we find that the crops which were the food crops like jowar and bajra, they were not being grown because there was some kind of a shift. So the poor person's food crops like jowar, bajra, they were grown on a lesser land, which caused disaster during the famine years. And due to the low prices and the high taxation, the productive investment or the innovation remained a very risky business. So we find that the impact on the peasants in the context in the context of the famines which we see during this period of time, that how so many famines in different parts of India, and because when the lands they were being used for the cash crops, then the other food crops like jowar and bajra, which were consumed by the rural population, they were not being grown. So it had a very disastrous impact in the context of the agricultural practices and the peasant economy that way. And there were no any kind of incentives for any kind of productive investment or innovations during this time, because the taxes were comparatively very, very high. So there is another aspect with regard to commercialization of agriculture, which has been talked about by the historians, and whether it led to the capitalist relations. And Harry Clever sees the evolution of the capitalist relations. Mithila Mukherjee see an apparently semi-feudal form of surplus appropriation of rent in kind, and remarkable increase in the degree of monetization. So we find that whether commercialization of agriculture, it led to the development of the capitalist relations during this time. So some of the scholars, they see that definitely it led to the capitalist relations during this period. And on the other hand, there are other scholars who reject this idea, and they see that the semi-feudal form of surplus appropriation was a comparatively better thing which could be seen during this period. And we also find that scholars, they have talked in the framework of the feudal relations and how the proliferation of the capitalist relations during this time. And they have also argued in the framework of the coexistence of the feudal and the capitalist mode of production. For example, Amit Bhaduri and Hamza Alve have talked in this context. And how we find that scholars like Sumit Sarkar, he has also argued that how it did contribute to the differentiation within the peasantry, but hardly to any real growth except perhaps in the few pockets. So Sumit Sarkar argues in this context that in certain pockets some kind of development might have taken place, but it was not there in the entire sectors, and the differentiation in peasantry could be seen, and how Indian peasant was dependent on a very far off land with which he did not have any kind of a direct link. That was another important aspect with regard to the commercialization of agriculture. Scholars, they have also talked that how the cultivators, they also suffered a lot of losses during this time. Saugat Mukherjee, for example, as you can see on the screen, talks about this aspect during the growing of jute during the years of the depression, and after, and how it eroded the base of existence for the majority of peasants. So the scholars, they have tried to understand the situation of the agriculturists in different regions where different kinds of cash crops they were being grown, and how during years of depression and after the base of the existence of the majority of peasants, it was eroded during this time. And any peasant who had some kind of a funds for himself, whether he was able to secure some kind of fund, and those funds, they were not being invested in the land, rather those funds, they were in a way given to other intermediaries, the people, those who will utilize those funds for their own purposes. So that kind of an investment in terms of farming could not be seen during this time, which was one of the important, one of the handicaps which we see, that even when the kind of some kind of profits they could be seen by the peasants, but those profits, they were not being invested in the land during this time. Scholars like Sugat Bose, they have seen the primary producers could hardly reap the benefits of boom in the jute market during this time, and how the jute manufacturers and the exporters, they were able to exercise the monopoly power as the purchasers of the raw jute. So we find that different scholars, they are trying to understand the situation in the international market, and how these scholars, they see that how Indian peasants, they were at a receiving end. Scholars like Tirthankar Roy, on the other hand, they argue that it is possible that the capitalist captured most or all of the increase in value added during this time, and rich may have become richer, but that does not mean that poor got poorer as total income increased. So there are scholars like Tirthankar Roy who try to see some kind of a silver lining, and they argue that you cannot just say that the people, those who became rich during this time, it means that the poor got poorer as the total income during this period increases. And this has been criticized even by Shekhar Bandyopadhyay, and he argues that it does not mean that some people became rich. It does not mean that if poor did not become poorer during this period, it is some kind of a there is no dynamism in this kind of an idea. So it is not an idea by we can say that the poor peasants they became rich, or they were able to have some kind of better resources for themselves. And we see that commercialization of agriculture basically in a way created that kind of a differentiation within the Indian peasantry. And some scholars, they have argued in the framework of the positives of the agriculture, the commercialization of agriculture, that how it was able to create some kind of prosperity in certain areas, and the accumulation of wealth also takes place in certain areas, and also regional specialization and the growth of markets. So the regional specialization idea, that in certain regions where the particular cash crops they were being grown, they were able to specialize in the cultivation of such kind of crops. So the idea of regional specialization is seen as one sort of a positive idea by the scholars, those who have tried to see the positives out of the commercialization of agriculture. We also find in the context of the positives, as you can see on the screen, that how the type of agriculture, this kind of agriculture also went with improved communications, as has been talked about with regard to the development of the telegraph and the railway lines. Also the possibilities of local scarcities escalating into famines, they were reduced. Some scholars, they argue in this framework, but we basically find that local scarcities rather in a way escalated during this time, and more famines during the colonial period could be seen. And they also argue in the framework of the commercial circuit that how it was internationalized, that how Indian farmers they got attached with the international market in the long run, and their linkages, they were also being established. Some scholars, they have argued in the framework of whether in commercialization of agriculture was a forced process, and how whether it was a forced process or it was not a forced process. And B.B. Chaudhary argues in this framework that it was a partially forced process, and during the boom period, the number of peasants those who were engaged, they increased, and it showed that they were attracted by the expectations of the higher returns during this time. And Asiya Siddiqui argues that it was not really a forced process. It did not benefit the primary producers in the boom period in northern India, and all the benefits were not appropriated by creditors themselves. So we have different or varying kinds of viewpoints with regard to whether it was a forced process, whether peasants they were being forced or they were not being forced. Smith Sarkar argues in that context that for the vast majority of poor peasants it was a forced process, as money was needed to meet the growing burden of revenue and the rent in cash. And the statement of the Coimbatore peasants, by growing each crop they now went half fed, but at least had money with which to meet revenue demands. Sumit Sarkar argues is that the point is not that so many peasants suffered, but that they suffered for nothing. So scholars like Sumit Sarkar, they argue in this context that if for the poorer peasants it was definitely a forced process, and how they needed money to pay the land revenue, and how the rent was paid in cash, and how we also find that this kind of a thing which was being undertaken, the commercialization, and how the peasants, they suffered for nothing. So if we want to conclude, we will find that commercialization of agriculture was directly connected with the idea of British greed and the way they made changes in the Indian agriculture. And definitely it was a forced process, because how peasants, they felt oppressed and exploited. And definitely development in the context of the capitalist relations, we find that British, they tried to create such kind of a situation. And so there is a divergent viewpoint with regard to the development of the capitalist relations, though those who argue that definitely some shades of the capitalist relations as well as the feudal form, both of them, they were there, and one has to understand them in the context of the regional variations which were there. So I'd like to end the discussion here. Thank you very much.